He didn't say much. Just wore a flannel shirt, jeans, and a ball cap with no insignia. His stance was old school, flawless. He didn't need to make a scene. The younger guys thought he was just some retired trucker wasting ammo. That was until a SEAL recruit caught a glimpse of the tattoo on his forearm while reloading. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't bright. But it was a symbol you don't just ink. You earn it. The recruit froze, not because it was some showy tattoo, but because it wasn't. It was simple, subtle, and it wasn't until then that the rest of the range fell into a quiet reverence. The recruit was curious, so he asked where he served, but the answer wasn't words, just a number, just a year. And in that moment, something shifted. The laughter and the jokes fell silent. Welcome to the human stories. Before we dive into this tale of silence, skill, and forgotten legends, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and let's make sure they are. The range opened at 7 a.m., but the old man, he was always there by 6:45. He didn't talk much, signed in with a slow, deliberate scrawl on the clipboard at the front desk. Just his last name, Martin. No rank, no pleasantries, no small talk, just a nod to the guy behind the counter. And then he walked down the same quiet path to lane 7, the furthest lane, the one farthest from the Bluetooth speakers and ego talk. The same thing every time. Faded jeans, a tan flannel shirt rolled up to his forearms, a brown baseball cap, once blue, now weathered. No patches, no slogans. The brim was just enough to shade his eyes. His boots were worn but clean. His range bag, carried in his right hand, steady, never carried more than what he needed. A single pistol case, a box of .45s, and a battered thermos that never left his bench. The regulars called him Pops, or just the old guy. Half of them thought he was just another ex-trucker with a pension and too much time. They joked that he only ever brought one target and left after 30 rounds. But the staff noticed something different. The way he moved. The way he surveyed his surroundings with quiet precision. He didn't focus on the paper silhouette downrange. He looked at the metal behind it, as if calculating wind speed that wasn't even there. He never flinched, never wasted a bullet. He never picked up his brass. The guys on the line didn't notice, but those who knew what to look for, they saw it. That morning, the range was more crowded than usual. A group of young Navy recruits had come in together. Off duty, full of jokes, full of bravado. One of them, tall and lean with a crew cut and a trident pin on his gym bag, set up 2 lanes over from Martin. His name was Jared. He was a SEAL trainee, fresh off leave before advanced training in Coronado. Confident, focused, sharp enough to know what real looked like. At first, he didn't pay much attention to Martin. Just another civilian shooting away next to him. But then he heard it. The rhythm. Not the volume, not the recoil, but the pattern. 3 shots, reset. 2 shots, reset. All tight, all deliberate. No wasted motion. Jared glanced sideways. The old man's grip was textbook, his stance pure. He wasn't reacting to the gun. He was controlling it. That's when Jared leaned slightly, catching a glimpse of the tattoo on the old man's forearm as he reloaded. It was faint, sun-faded, but unmistakable. A number, simple, small. And that insignia? Jared recognized it immediately. He froze. The ink wasn't from a trendy shop. It was from a time when tattoos were earned, not designed. Jared hesitated. Glanced at the old man's target, watching the grouping get tighter with every shot. Curiosity outweighed caution, so he took a step closer and spoke up. "Excuse me, sir," Jared said quietly. "That ink on your arm, that's first recon, isn't it?" The old man didn't turn to him, didn't smile. He just emptied his mag with one final perfect shot, set the pistol down slowly, and finally looked Jared in the eye. His answer came without a smile. Once. Just once. That was it. Jared knew exactly what it meant. For a moment, Jared stood still. It wasn't a dismissal. It was something heavier. Like a door cracked open just wide enough to say, "Don't push it." So Jared didn't. Not yet. He nodded and stepped back to his lane, but the rhythm of his shooting changed. It wasn't the same anymore. His movements weren't as fluid. His eyes kept drifting to the left, where Martin was still shooting. The young recruits hadn't noticed. They were laughing, comparing groupings, making bets. One of them, a younger guy named Petty, leaned over and chuckled. "Hey, that old guy's still doing okay, huh?" Jared didn't answer. He just kept watching. He was thinking. He'd seen that kind of shooting before, but only from instructors. The kind who didn't need to raise their voice to command respect. The kind you shut up for. 15 minutes later, Martin finished his box of .45s, 30 rounds. Not one miss outside the inner circle. He set the pistol down, pulled a faded rag from his bag, and began cleaning it right there, without any hurry. Jared hesitated. Then, stepping over once again, he spoke quietly. "Sir," Jared said, "if you don't mind me asking, when did you serve?" Martin didn't answer right away. He set the rag down, locked the slide open, and looked at Jared, not irritated, not guarded, just calm. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. 66 to 74. Recon Southeast Asia. Jared swallowed. He hadn't been wrong. That lined up exactly with what he'd thought. And the tattoo, the one that wasn't flashy, the one that wasn't meant to be seen, it wasn't for fun. It was Marine 1st Recon, a forward unit, deep ops, black radio silence. The kind of deployment where names didn't go home, where files mysteriously went missing. "You were in Laos?" Jared asked. Martin gave a half nod. "Among other places." That was when the noise from the other lanes seemed to fade. Not literally, but in feel, the atmosphere in the range shifted, like everything had compacted into a quiet corridor around Lane 7. Even the joking behind them softened. A few of the younger guys had picked up on Jared body language. One or two had started watching from a distance, not as loudly as before. "Did you ever train with the SEALs?" Jared asked. He couldn't help it. The curiosity, the pull to know more, it was irresistible. Martin allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "We all did a little of everything back then. You swam, you survived, or you didn't." Jared couldn't help but grin. "Sir, my CO told us about an op in 71, deep jungle recovery. The guy who led the extraction was wounded, but he carried 2 men out under fire. They said it was classified for years." Martin didn't blink. He didn't look surprised. "A lot of things were classified for years," he said. And just like that, the door was closed again. Not harshly, but enough to remind Jared that some stories weren't meant to be shared. They were carried, like rounds that hadn't been fired, like names that weren't written on medals. Martin stood, stretched his back, and zipped his range bag. Jared instinctively stepped aside to let him pass. A few of the other shooters glanced over, curious, but there was no joke in their eyes now. Something about the way the young SEAL moved told them that the man leaving wasn't just anyone. As Martin turned to go, Jared did something rare. He snapped to attention. No sarcasm, no joke, just respect. "Sir," Jared said, his voice steady, "thank you for your service. Truly." Martin paused mid-step, turning slightly. He studied Jared for a long moment. Then, without a word, he walked back over slowly and placed something into Jared's hand. A coin. Heavy. Real. It bore the 1st Recon insignia on one side and a single word on the other. "Still here." Martin leaned in, his voice low. "You'll know when it's your time to go quiet. Until then, earn it." Then he turned and walked away, without a salute, without a handshake. Just a man disappearing into the morning sun, leaving behind a silence louder than any story he could have told. Martin was gone before most of them even noticed. No goodbye, no nod. He just picked up his bag, thermos tucked under one arm, and disappeared into the rising sun like the morning had already been done with him. Jared stood there for a long moment, the weight of the coin still in his palm, his mind spinning faster than his pulse. He'd seen men try to fake valor, seen posers wearing stolen insignia and made-up patches. But this was something else entirely. The coin wasn't decorative. It wasn't mass-produced. It was the kind that was never supposed to exist in the first place. "Yo, Jared," one of his buddies called from a few lanes down. "You good?" Jared didn't answer at first. Then he slowly turned, walking toward them. He held out the coin without saying a word. They crowded around him, expecting a joke, another smart remark. But as soon as they saw the insignia, the conversation dropped. The laughing died. Petty, the guy who had been cracking jokes earlier, muttered under his breath, "No way. That's real." Jared nodded. "It is." Another guy frowned. "Who gave it to you?" Jared's eyes scanned the empty lane Martin had stood in. "The man you all ignored? The one you laughed at? That was Staff Sergeant Thomas Martin." None of them responded. They didn't need to. The silence in their throats said more than words could. Jared walked back to the front desk, the coin still clutched tightly in his hand. The guy behind the counter was sipping coffee, scrolling through his phone. He looked up casually. "Everything all right?" Jared placed the coin gently on the counter. "You know this man?" The clerk squinted. "That old guy from lane 7? Jared nodded. "Name's Martin. What's his first name?" Jared asked. The clerk turned to his screen, tapped a few keys. "Let me check. T. Martin," he said after a moment. "Signed up almost 10 years ago. Never missed a payment. No credit card, just cash. No email either. Old school all the way." He paused. "Whoa, hold on. Says here," he marked, "do not publish name for recognition, events, or honors." "That's rare." Jared leaned in. "You know why?" The clerk shrugged. "Nah. The only thing he's ever said to me was once, when I thanked him for his service. He looked me dead in the eye and said, 'I didn't do it for you to thank me.'" The guy chuckled nervously. "I didn't bring it up again." Jared didn't laugh. He just looked down at the coin again. Without saying another word, he walked out of the building. That night, he couldn't let it go. He tried to sleep, but he couldn't. Around midnight, he booted up his laptop, dug into declassified archives, and began piecing it together. It took hours. Most names were redacted. Some dates were wrong on purpose. But eventually, buried in a Mac VOG log from 1971, there it was. One line. No ceremony, no headline. Just S. Sergeant Thomas Martin, 1st Recon, Laos, March 6th. Extraction under fire. Recovered 7. Refused medevac. Wounded twice. Declined award. Recommendation buried. Note, asset considered irreplaceable. Now silent. That word, silent, hit Jared like a punch to the gut. Silent. That was the mission back then. You did the job. You didn't talk. You didn't write books. You didn't tweet about your trauma. You carried it quietly forever. And Martin had carried it all the way to that plastic bench at the range. All the way to that last box of .45 ACP. All the way through decades of being just another old man in a flannel shirt. But now Jared knew, and so did the rest of them. The next week, Martin showed up just like always. Same truck, same time, same quiet steps across the gravel lot. He nodded to the guy behind the counter, signed his name on the clipboard, and made his way to lane 7. His boots crunched softly beneath him, and in his hand, the same old range bag, zipper halfway open, with just one pistol inside, a box of 30 rounds. The same battered thermos tucked under his elbow. Nothing had changed. Nothing at all. But this time, something in the air felt different. Jared was already there, waiting, just like the others. Not just him, either. 3 of the guys from his team had arrived before sunrise and were waiting near the back bench. They didn't say a word when Martin walked by. They didn't interrupt him. They simply stood a little straighter, gave him a nod, and watched, with the kind of attention usually reserved for instructors, not old men in denim. Martin set up without glancing their way. He pinned his target, adjusted his stance, but he noticed the silence, not the absence of gunfire. That was still there, but something had shifted. The noise behind him wasn't as loud. There was less swagger in the way the other guys loaded their mags. A little more respect in the way lanes were cleared. A little more patience in how they prepared. Halfway through his second string of fire, Jared stepped over. This time, it wasn't casual. This time, it was composed, controlled. He waited for Martin to finish his grouping, and then quietly extended something to him. A fresh ammo box. Sealed .45 caliber. Martin looked at it, then at Jared. No smile, just a question in his eyes. Jared didn't say anything. He simply said, "I figured 30 rounds was enough today." For the first time, Martin gave a nod that lasted more than half a second. He accepted the box, reloaded calmly, and continued firing. No words, just the soft, unmistakable rhythm of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Later, after the brass had settled and the smell of gunpowder had thinned from the air, Martin sat on the edge of the wooden bench, sipping from his thermos. One by one, the younger men passed him, not as a crowd, not in a line, but quietly, individually. A nod, a handshake, a simple sir. Nothing rehearsed, nothing forced. Petty, the kid who had cracked jokes just a week earlier, lingered a little longer than the others. He cleared his throat. "We looked you up," he said. "Some of us, you saved a lot of people." Martin wiped the rim of his thermos with his sleeve. "They saved each other," he said softly. Petty opened his mouth to respond, but thought better of it. He just nodded and walked away. The last to remain was Jared. He sat beside Martin on the bench, both men staring downrange at nothing in particular. For a while, they didn't speak. Finally, Jared asked, "You ever think about teaching?" Martin exhaled slowly. "I spent 30 years trying to forget everything I teach. But some of us need to remember it." Jared didn't respond right away. He took another sip from his own thermos. The sky had turned a deeper blue, the sunlight catching faint dust in the air. Finally, Martin turned slightly toward him. "You don't teach this," Martin said, his voice low. "You absorb it, quietly over time." Jared nodded. "That's why I'm still listening." Martin looked at him longer this time, then stood up. He stretched his back. Then, "Don't talk so much," he said with a small chuckle. Jared smiled. The two of them chuckled quietly, sharing a rare, unspoken understanding. Martin walked away, leaving the fresh ammo box untouched on the bench. It was a small gesture, but it said everything. That afternoon, the range staff made a small change. A brass plate, no bigger than a business card, was screwed into the wood above Lane 7. It didn't say hero. It didn't say legend. It didn't even say recon. It simply said, "Lane reserved until he says otherwise." Martin never asked who put it there, and he never told him to take it down. Some men teach with words. Others teach with their presence. Martin never told war stories. He never raised his voice. He never asked for a thank you. He showed up, took his 30 shots, and left a bigger impact than most men who speak for hours. He never needed to prove anything. Not to the range, not to the young guys beside him, not even to the generation who forgot to ask. But when one of them finally looked close enough to see the truth beneath his sleeve, the silence broke. The following week, Martin returned. Just like always, same truck, same time, same quiet steps across the gravel lot. Jared had arrived early again, but this time he wasn't alone. A few of the other shooters from the previous week, including Petty and a couple of others, had shown up too. They stood near the back, waiting. They didn't speak when Martin walked by. There was no joking, no loud conversation. Instead, they simply watched with a kind of respect that hadn't been there before. Martin walked through the entrance, signed in with his usual slow, deliberate scrawl. His presence had shifted something that wasn't so easy to put into words. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. But somehow, he had become more than just the old man with a gun. Martin took his usual path to Lane 7. No one bothered him. No one interrupted. There was something about him now, something that commanded a quiet space around him. Even the staff behind the counter seemed to notice. The hum of chatter, the noise from the younger guys. It was all softer, quieter. Martin's presence had done that. It had made the world feel just a little more still, a little more purposeful. As Martin settled in at his bench, the others followed suit, but it wasn't with the same carefree attitude as before. They were focused. Every movement seemed to carry weight now. Jared watched Martin from his position on the line, observing the way the old man moved. Every action deliberate, every movement with purpose. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't trying to show off. He was simply doing what he did best. And in the process, he was teaching more than anyone had realized. Jared could feel the shift in the air around him. He wasn't just observing Martin anymore. He was absorbing what Martin had been teaching without ever saying a word. It wasn't about the targets, the rounds, or the guns. It was about the way a person carried themselves, the way they commanded respect without asking for it. The regulars who had once ignored Martin now watched him closely. They didn't ask questions. They didn't push for more details. They simply acknowledged the man's skill and presence. Martin's legacy wasn't his stories or his medals. It was in the way he moved, the way he stood, and the way he never needed to prove anything to anyone. As the session came to a close, Martin finished his last 30 rounds. Every shot as perfect as the last. When he finished, he set the pistol down, wiped it clean with the same faded rag, and stood up. He didn't speak, didn't exchange pleasantries with anyone. He simply packed his things, zipped his range bag, and turned to walk away. But this time, something was different. The men around him stood a little straighter. They didn't interrupt his departure. They didn't speak. They just watched him leave, silently acknowledging the man who had quietly taught them more than they realized. Jared was the last one to watch him go. He stood still for a moment, his mind racing with thoughts, and then he walked up to the front counter, coin still in hand. The clerk looked up from his phone, just like he always did. "You know him, don't you?" Jared asked, his voice quieter than usual. The clerk squinted. "That old guy from lane 7? Jared nodded, looking down at the coin he still held. The clerk paused, tapping at his screen. "Yeah, that's him. T. Martin. No email, no social media. Just cash for payments. Old school," he said, looking at the screen in front of him. "He's been coming here for years. But it says here," the clerk paused and looked at the screen again. "It says he doesn't want his name published for recognition. No events. No honors. That's rare." Jared's grip on the coin tightened slightly. "Did he ever mention why?" The clerk shrugged. "Nah, not really. One time, I thanked him for his service, and he just looked me in the eye and said, 'I didn't do it for you to thank me.'" Jared stayed silent for a moment. Then, without another word, he left the range, the weight of the coin still in his hand, heavy with unspoken history. Later that night, back at home, Jared couldn't shake the feeling of that silence. It gnawed at him, pulling him in deeper. He fired up his laptop and dove into declassified records, searching for answers. It took hours, but eventually he found it. One line, buried deep in the archives of 1971 Mac VOG log. S. Sergeant Thomas Martin, 1st Recon, Laos, March 6. Extraction under fire. Recovered 7. Refused medevac. Wounded twice. Decline award. Recommendation buried. Note, asset considered irreplaceable. Now silent. Silent. The word stuck with him. Silent. That was the mission. You did your job. You didn't talk. You didn't tell anyone what you saw, what you did. You carried it with you, and you carried it forever. There were no stories, no medals, just the weight of the work and the silence that came with it. And now Jared knew the truth. Martin wasn't just an old man in a range. He was a legend. He was part of a story that had been buried, a history that had never been told. He wasn't seeking fame or recognition. He was simply living out the quiet life of someone who had done his duty and kept moving forward. But now the rest of them knew, and that would never be the same. The next time Martin returned to the range, it was like no time had passed. The same truck, the same boots, the same quiet walk across the gravel lot. But this time, the energy was different. Jared arrived early, not alone this time, but with a handful of other men from his unit. They didn't joke. They didn't laugh. They didn't boast about how well they were shooting or make bets about who could land the tightest grouping. They were there, simply watching Martin. The young recruits had figured out by now. They'd seen the way Jared had stood the other day, the way he had watched Martin with quiet respect. They had followed his lead, too, and now they knew the story. They'd looked it up. They understood. And just like that, the room had shifted. Martin wasn't just an old man at the range. He wasn't just another guy with a gun. He was someone they could learn from, someone they could respect. Jared didn't need to say anything. The others weren't asking questions anymore. They were watching. They were learning. As Martin set up, he didn't seem to notice the shift. His movements were still slow, deliberate, as if he were in no rush. He didn't look at the young men around him. He didn't engage in conversation. He just shot. Perfect shot after perfect shot. Jared found himself looking at Martin more than he ever had before, noticing the small things. The way his hands never shook when he reloaded, how he always double-checked the position of his feet before taking his stance, the subtle way his eyes scanned the target, as if seeing more than the rest of them could. Martin's presence had become something profound, even without trying. After a while, Jared stepped over to Martin again. This time, there were no jokes. No words were needed. He simply walked up, stood beside Martin, and handed him a new box of rounds. Martin glanced over, gave him a brief nod, and accepted the box without a word. And just like that, the unspoken agreement had been made. There was no need for more conversation. No need to ask for anything. They understood each other. The respect was there, without needing to be said aloud. As the morning wore on, more of the younger recruits drifted toward Martin's lane. But this time, it wasn't out of curiosity. It was out of respect. They didn't interrupt him. They didn't try to engage him in small talk. They just observed quietly. They watched the way he moved, the way he shot, and they learned without realizing they were learning. By the time Martin had finished his rounds, the atmosphere in the range had changed completely. It wasn't loud anymore. It wasn't filled with jokes and bravado. It had become quieter, more focused. The young men around him had figured out that some stories don't need to be told. They're simply carried through the actions, the silence, the presence. As Martin packed up and headed for the door, something felt different. He didn't stop to say goodbye to anyone. He didn't need to. He didn't need to make a scene. He just walked out the door, his bag slung over his shoulder, his thermos tucked under his arm. But the way the others looked at him as he left, that had changed. There was no joking, no teasing. There were only nods, a few quiet sirs, and some looks that spoke volumes. Jared followed him out, the coin still in his pocket. He wasn't in a hurry to leave. He wasn't in a hurry to forget. As he stood by his truck, watching Martin's silhouette fade into the distance, he realized something. There are men in this world who don't need to be seen to matter. They don't need accolades or public recognition. Their presence alone, the way they move, the way they carry themselves, speaks louder than any award ever could. Later that day, Jared found himself sitting at his desk, the weight of the coin heavy in his palm once more. He had spent hours researching, but it wasn't just about Martin's service. It wasn't just about the man who had silently shaped the lives of the people around him. It was about the way history gets carried in silence. How some people live lives that go unnoticed by most, but to those who are paying attention, their impact is immeasurable. As Jared sat there, staring at the coin, he knew he'd never forget the lesson Martin had taught him. Not just through his shooting, but through the silence, the presence, and the quiet dignity with which he carried his past. Some stories are never told. Some warriors don't need to shout. They don't need to make sure everyone knows their name. They just need to be noticed by the right people. And for Jared, Martin's story wasn't something that needed to be retold. It was something that would be carried, silently, for as long as he could remember. The next time Martin showed up at the range, the regulars had made a small change. Above lane 7, a brass plate had been screwed into the wood. It didn't say hero. It didn't say legend. It didn't even say recon. It just said, lane reserved until he says otherwise. No need to ask who put it there. No need to ever take it down. Some men teach with words. Others teach with their presence. And Martin, the quiet warrior, had taught them all that presence is more powerful than anything words could ever be. That's the end of the story. Thanks for reading. Let me know if you want to talk about it more, or if you have other stories you'd like me to rewrite or help with.